What if I told you that a country slightly smaller than California is single-handedly keeping the entire global economy from collapsing? While everyone's busy watching China and the United States, Malaysia is quietly controlling something so critical that 20 countries would literally face economic chaos if it disappeared tomorrow. And here's the crazy part. Most people have absolutely no idea this is happening. By the end of this video, you'll understand why Singapore, despite being richer, depends on Malaysia for its very survival. Why China, the world's second largest economy, has a massive vulnerability that only Malaysia can solve. And why your smartphone, your car, and even your medical devices wouldn't exist without this Southeast Asian nation. Stay with me, because number 7 will completely change how you see global power, and what I reveal at number 1 will genuinely shock you. Malaysia isn't just another developing country trying to find its place in the world. With a GDP of over $400 billion and a strategic location that makes it the gatekeeper of global trade, this nation has quietly positioned itself as irreplaceable. But here's what makes this story absolutely fascinating. Malaysia didn't achieve this through military might or natural resources alone. They did it through strategic intelligence that most countries completely overlooked. You see, while other nations were fighting for oil dominance or manufacturing supremacy, Malaysia was cornering markets that nobody else thought were important at the time. And now? Now the world has realized these markets are absolutely critical, but it's too late. Malaysia already controls them. Let me show you exactly which countries are most dependent on Malaysia, and more importantly, why they can't simply replace it. Trust me, the reasons are far more interesting than you think. Let's start with number 20, Australia. Now, you might think Australia, being a massive resource-rich continent, wouldn't need anyone. But here's the twist. Malaysia is Australia's fourth largest trading partner in Asia, and Australian businesses have invested over $20 billion in Malaysia. But the real dependency runs deeper. Malaysia is the gateway for Australian exports into Southeast Asia, a region with 700 million people. Without Malaysia's ports and trade infrastructure, Australian goods would face massive logistical nightmares reaching these markets. And here's something most people don't know. Malaysia processes a huge amount of Australian raw materials, turning them into finished products that Australia then imports back at a premium. It's a cycle Australia can't easily break. Number 19, Indonesia. This seems counterintuitive, right? Indonesia is massive, has 280 million people, and is resource-rich. But despite being neighbors, Indonesia depends heavily on Malaysia for refined petroleum products. Indonesia might have the crude oil, but Malaysia has the refining capacity and expertise. Additionally, millions of Indonesians work in Malaysia, sending back remittances that support entire communities back home. The economic relationship is so intertwined that any disruption would affect Indonesia's economy within weeks. Coming in at number 18, the Philippines. Over 200,000 Filipinos call Malaysia home, and the money they send back accounts for a significant portion of remittances flowing into the Philippines. But there's more. Malaysia is a critical trade partner for Philippine electronics and agricultural products. The Philippines also relies on Malaysia for halal-certified products and Islamic finance expertise, sectors where Malaysia is the global leader. If Malaysia closed its doors tomorrow, the Philippines would scramble to find alternatives. Number 17, Thailand. Despite being competitors in some industries, Thailand and Malaysia are deeply interconnected. Malaysia is Thailand's third largest trading partner in ASEAN, and the two countries share crucial supply chains in the automotive and electronics sectors. But here's the hidden dependency. Malaysia's rubber and palm oil industries supply critical raw materials to Thai manufacturers. Without these supplies, Thailand's manufacturing sector would face immediate shortages. Number 16, Vietnam. Vietnam's explosive economic growth over the last decade has one secret ingredient many don't talk about: Malaysia. Malaysian companies have poured billions into Vietnam's manufacturing sector, bringing expertise, technology, and connections. Malaysia is also a key supplier of palm oil, rubber, and electronic components that Vietnam's factories desperately need. The two economies are now so integrated that Vietnam's supply chains would face serious disruptions without Malaysian inputs. But here's where things get really interesting, because the next countries on this list aren't just dependent on Malaysia, they've structured their entire economic strategies around it. Number 15. The United Arab Emirates. You'd think an oil-rich Gulf nation would be completely self-sufficient. But Malaysia has something the UAE desperately wants: expertise in Islamic finance and halal industries. The UAE has positioned itself as a global Islamic economy hub, and guess who they learned from and partner with extensively? Malaysia. Malaysian companies help certify halal products for the UAE market, and Malaysia's Islamic banking model is literally the blueprint the UAE follows. Beyond that, trade between the two countries exceeds $10 billion annually, with Malaysia supplying everything from palm oil to electrical equipment. Number 14. Turkey. Turkey's relationship with Malaysia goes deep. As two major Muslim-majority nations with modern economies, they've created strategic partnerships in defense, aerospace, and technology. But here's the key dependency: Malaysia supplies Turkey with critical palm oil and rubber products, while Turkish construction and defense companies rely on Malaysian investment and collaboration for major projects. The two countries have also created joint ventures in third-party nations, meaning their economic fates are intertwined globally, not just bilaterally. Number 13. South Korea. Samsung, LG, Hyundai, these Korean giants all have massive operations in Malaysia. But it goes beyond just having factories there. Malaysia is South Korea's fourth largest trading partner in ASEAN, and Korean companies depend on Malaysia for critical components in their supply chains. Malaysian electronic components, rubber products, and chemicals are essential inputs for Korean manufacturing. Plus, Malaysia serves as South Korea's strategic gateway into Southeast Asian markets. If Malaysia redirected these resources elsewhere, Korean companies would face billion-dollar disruptions. Number 12. Bangladesh. With over 170 million people, Bangladesh might seem self-sufficient, but the country faces a critical problem: refined petroleum and chemical products. Malaysia supplies these essentials that keep Bangladesh's factories running. Beyond that, Malaysia is a crucial market for Bangladeshi garments and textiles. But here's the real dependency: Malaysian investment in Bangladesh's infrastructure and energy sectors is substantial. Projects financed and built by Malaysian companies are literally powering Bangladesh's growth. Number 11. India. Now we're talking about a massive economy with over 1.4 billion people. How could India possibly depend on Malaysia? Here's how. India is Malaysia's second largest trading partner from South Asia, with bilateral trade exceeding $15 billion. But the real story is palm oil. India is the world's largest importer of palm oil, and Malaysia is one of only two countries that can supply it at the scale India needs. Without Malaysian palm oil, India would face a cooking oil crisis that would affect hundreds of millions of people. Additionally, Malaysian investment in Indian infrastructure, technology, and manufacturing is substantial. The two countries have created integrated supply chains that can't be easily replaced. And you know what's wild? These are just the countries in the second tier of dependency. Wait until you see the top 10, because that's where Malaysia's real power becomes undeniable. Number 10. The United Kingdom. Britain might be thousands of miles away, but its economic ties to Malaysia are surprisingly deep, rooted in their colonial history but evolved into something far more significant. Malaysia is the UK's second largest trading partner in Southeast Asia, with trade exceeding £5 billion annually. But here's what most people miss: Malaysia is a critical market for British services, particularly in finance, education, and professional services. British universities have entire campuses in Malaysia, generating hundreds of millions in revenue. British financial institutions use Malaysia as their Southeast Asian hub, and Malaysian investment in the UK, particularly in real estate and infrastructure, runs into billions. The relationship is so deep that economic problems in Malaysia would directly impact British businesses and jobs. Number 9. The European Union collectively. If we look at the EU as a single entity, the dependency becomes even clearer. Malaysia is the EU's third largest trading partner in Southeast Asia, with trade exceeding €35 billion. European manufacturers, especially in automotive and machinery sectors, rely heavily on Malaysian components and raw materials. But here's the critical part. Malaysia supplies 44% of the world's palm oil, and Europe needs it for everything from food products to biofuels. The EU has tried to reduce palm oil dependence for environmental reasons, but the reality is there's no viable alternative at the scale they need. European companies have also invested over €20 billion in Malaysia, creating thousands of jobs both in Malaysia and back home through supply chain connections. Number 8. Taiwan. This is where things get really technical and fascinating. Taiwan's semiconductor industry is legendary, but here's a secret. Malaysian suppliers provide critical materials and components that Taiwan's chip manufacturers need. Beyond semiconductors, Taiwan and Malaysia have deeply integrated supply chains in electronics, machinery, and rubber products. Taiwanese companies have invested billions in Malaysian manufacturing, using it as a production base to serve global markets. The relationship is so critical that disruptions in Malaysia would directly impact Taiwan's ability to produce the chips that power everything from smartphones to military systems. And given Taiwan's geopolitical situation, having Malaysia as a stable partner and alternative production base is strategically invaluable. Number 7. The United States. Here's where minds start blowing. America, the world's largest economy, dependent on Malaysia? Absolutely. And it's not just a small dependency, it's structural. The United States is Malaysia's third largest trading partner globally, with trade exceeding $60 billion annually. But here's what makes this fascinating. American companies, particularly in tech and semiconductors, have made Malaysia an irreplaceable part of their supply chains. Companies like Intel, Motorola, and Western Digital have massive operations in Malaysia, and they didn't just set up shop there, they've integrated Malaysian suppliers and expertise into their global operations. Malaysia produces critical components that go into American products across multiple industries. But there's more. Malaysia provides 44% of the world's natural rubber, which American manufacturers need for everything from tires to medical gloves. Speaking of medical gloves, here's something that became crystal clear during the pandemic. Malaysia produces 65% of the world's rubber gloves. When COVID-19 hit and suddenly the world needed billions of gloves, everyone realized just how dependent they were on Malaysia. American hospitals, despite being in the wealthiest country on earth, were at the mercy of Malaysian production capacity. And here's the strategic element. Malaysia occupies one of the most important geographic positions on earth. It sits along the Strait of Malacca, through which 40% of global trade passes. For the United States, having Malaysia as a stable, friendly partner is crucial for maintaining freedom of navigation and trade in the Indo-Pacific region. If Malaysia shifted its allegiances or faced instability, American strategic interests would be seriously compromised. Number 6. Japan. Japan's dependency on Malaysia is both obvious and hidden. The obvious part. Japan is Malaysia's fourth largest trading partner globally, with trade exceeding $30 billion. Japanese companies like Sony, Panasonic, and Toyota have massive manufacturing operations in Malaysia. But here's the hidden dependency. Japan, being resource poor, relies on Malaysia for critical raw materials, especially liquefied natural gas, palm oil, and rubber. Malaysia is one of Japan's key LNG suppliers, and given Japan's energy vulnerability, this relationship is absolutely critical. But there's an even deeper layer. After World War II, Japan pioneered the Look East policy, with Malaysia, essentially creating a special relationship where Malaysia became Japan's bridge to Southeast Asia and the Islamic world. Japanese companies don't just manufacture in Malaysia, they've transferred technology, built research centers, and created joint ventures that tie the two economies together. If Malaysia faced economic problems tomorrow, thousands of Japanese companies would face immediate supply chain disruptions. The automotive sector alone would take a massive hit, as Malaysian suppliers provide components for Japanese cars sold globally. Now, you might be thinking these dependencies are impressive, but wait. The top 5 countries are in a different category altogether. These are nations whose entire economic strategies, daily operations, or survival are tied to Malaysia in ways that would take decades to replace, if they could even be replaced at all. Number 5. Singapore. This is the relationship that defines irony in international economics. Singapore is richer than Malaysia on a per capita basis, more developed, and considered a first-world nation. But here's the reality: Singapore cannot survive without Malaysia. Let me explain why. First, the basics. Malaysia supplies Singapore with water. Not some of Singapore's water, the majority of it. Under agreements that date back decades, Malaysia provides raw water that Singapore treats and uses. Singapore has invested in desalination and recycling, but it still fundamentally depends on Malaysian water. If Malaysia turned off the tap, Singapore would face a crisis within days. But water is just the beginning. Singapore imports about 40% of its food from Malaysia. Fresh vegetables, fruits, poultry, eggs, these come across the border daily. Singapore has virtually no agricultural capacity of its own, so Malaysian farms literally keep Singapore fed. Then there's labor. Hundreds of thousands of Malaysians commute into Singapore daily to work, forming a critical portion of Singapore's workforce from construction to services. Without these workers, Singapore's economy would face immediate labor shortages. But here's the deepest dependency. Singapore's entire economic model relies on being the financial and logistics hub for Southeast Asia, and that model only works because of its relationship with Malaysia. Singapore's ports handle goods that originate from or are destined for Malaysia and the broader region. Malaysian companies use Singapore's financial services, and Singaporean companies use Malaysia for manufacturing and as a market. The two economies are so intertwined that they're essentially one economic unit despite being separate countries. Singapore knows this vulnerability. It's why they've invested billions in trying to reduce dependence, but geography and economics make it impossible. Singapore and Malaysia are stuck with each other, but Singapore is far more dependent than it likes to admit. Number 4. China. The world's second largest economy, a manufacturing superpower, and an emerging global leader. Surely China doesn't need Malaysia, right? Wrong. China's dependency on Malaysia is massive and growing. Trade between China and Malaysia exceeds $100 billion annually, making Malaysia one of China's top trading partners in Southeast Asia. But it's not just the volume, it's what's being traded. Malaysia supplies China with critical resources: palm oil, rubber, petroleum products, and liquefied natural gas. China's growing middle class needs these resources, and Malaysia is a key supplier. But here's where it gets strategic. China's entire Belt and Road Initiative, its plan to economically dominate Eurasia, depends heavily on Malaysia. Malaysia sits at the critical junction between the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. The Strait of Malacca, which Malaysia controls half of, is the gateway for 80% of China's energy imports. If that strait closed, China's economy would collapse within weeks. Having Malaysia as a partner is absolutely essential for China's energy security. Beyond that, Malaysia has become a critical production base for Chinese companies looking to avoid tariffs and access global markets. Chinese firms have invested billions in Malaysian manufacturing, especially in electronics and electric vehicles. Malaysia gives China a backdoor into markets that might otherwise be closed to Chinese products. And here's something fascinating. Malaysia is one of the few countries in the world that maintains genuinely good relations with both China and the United States. This makes Malaysia an invaluable diplomatic and economic bridge for China. If Malaysia tilted too far toward the west, China would lose strategic flexibility in Southeast Asia. Number 3. The global electronics industry. This might seem like cheating, it's not a country, but bear with me, because this affects every single person watching this video. Your smartphone, your laptop, the screen you're watching this on right now, there's a very high chance that critical components came from Malaysia. Malaysia is the world's 7th largest exporter of electronics and electrical products. But more importantly, it's embedded in the global supply chain at critical points. Malaysia is the world's leading exporter of semiconductor assembly and testing services. Companies design chips in America, fabricate them in Taiwan or South Korea, but they send them to Malaysia for testing and packaging. Without Malaysia, the global chip supply chain literally doesn't function. Malaysia also produces critical components for hard drives, LED displays, solar panels, and telecommunications equipment. During the pandemic, when chip shortages crippled global industries from automotive to consumer electronics, Malaysia was right at the center. Factories in Malaysia shut down, and suddenly car manufacturers worldwide couldn't produce vehicles. One country, affecting global industries worth trillions. The electronics dependency goes even deeper. Malaysia has developed such specialized expertise in certain manufacturing processes that replacing it would take years and cost billions. It's not just about cheap labor, it's about accumulated knowledge, trained workers, and established supply chains that took decades to build. Number 2. The global medical supply chain. Remember those rubber gloves I mentioned earlier? Let me break down just how dependent the world is on Malaysia for medical supplies, because this is genuinely mind-blowing. Malaysia produces 65% of the world's rubber gloves. Not just some, the majority. When COVID-19 hit and suddenly hospitals everywhere needed billions of gloves, the entire world was dependent on Malaysian factories. Nurses in New York, doctors in London, healthcare workers in Tokyo, all relying on gloves from Malaysia. But it's not just gloves. Malaysia is a major producer of medical devices, latex products, and pharmaceutical ingredients. Malaysian companies produce catheters, syringes, surgical equipment, and components for advanced medical devices. The global healthcare system is quietly but critically dependent on Malaysian manufacturing. During the pandemic, this dependency became a crisis. Malaysian factories faced labor shortages, COVID outbreaks, and lockdowns. Suddenly, hospitals worldwide faced glove shortages. Prices skyrocketed. Elective surgeries were delayed. The vulnerability was exposed for everyone to see. And here's the kicker: even after the pandemic, nothing has fundamentally changed. The world is still just as dependent on Malaysia for medical supplies. Why? Because building alternative supply chains takes years and billions of dollars in investment, and no other country has the combination of expertise, capacity, and cost-effectiveness that Malaysia offers. And now, the number 1 country that absolutely cannot survive without Malaysia. Number 1. Global trade itself, every country on Earth. Here's the truth that changes everything. Malaysia doesn't just supply specific countries with specific products. Malaysia controls the Strait of Malacca, the single most important maritime chokepoint in the world. Think about this: 40% of global trade passes through the Strait of Malacca. That's not 40% of regional trade. That's 40% of all trade on planet Earth. Ships carrying oil from the Middle East to Asia, container ships bringing goods from Asia to Africa, vessels transporting resources between continents, they all pass through waters that Malaysia controls along with Singapore and Indonesia. If the Strait of Malacca closed tomorrow, global trade would collapse. Energy prices would skyrocket. Supply chains would disintegrate. The economic impact would make the 2008 financial crisis look minor. Rerouting ships around Indonesia would add thousands of miles, weeks of time, and enormous costs. Many trade routes would become economically unviable. Malaysia's geographic position makes it irreplaceable in the global economic system. Every country that trades with Asia, every nation that imports energy from the Middle East, every economy that depends on global supply chains, they all depend on Malaysia maintaining stability and keeping the Strait of Malacca open and safe. This is power that doesn't come from military might or natural resources alone. It's power from geography, strategy, and the smart decisions Malaysia made over decades to position itself as indispensable. So there you have it, 20 countries in the entire global system that can't survive without Malaysia. From Singapore's daily water supply to China's energy security, from America's semiconductor supply chains to the world's medical gloves, from Europe's palm oil needs to the very routes that global trade flows through, Malaysia is embedded at critical points throughout the global economy. What makes this even more remarkable is that Malaysia achieved this not through conquest or coercion, but through strategic intelligence and economic positioning. While everyone was focused on traditional markers of power, Malaysia quietly made itself indispensable. The next time you hear about global superpowers, remember this: real power in the 21st century isn't just about military force or GDP size. It's about controlling what others can't live without. And by that measure, Malaysia is far more powerful than most people realize. This dependency isn't going away anytime soon. If anything, it's deepening. As global supply chains become more complex and interconnected, Malaysia's strategic position only becomes more valuable. The question isn't whether countries depend on Malaysia, they do, and they know it. The question is what Malaysia does with this power in the coming decades. If this changed how you see global economics and power, hit that like button and subscribe because we're diving deep into the hidden dependencies that actually run our world. Drop a comment telling me which dependency surprised you the most. And remember, the world is far more interconnected and fragile than it appears on the surface. Until next time, stay curious.